Who knew going electric requires electricity? Lionel Shriver writes about this seemingly obvious fact in her column this week, off the back of reports in America suggesting that the move to green energy is pushing demand for electricity to new highs. Lionel joins me now. Lionel, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. You write in the magazine this week about a revelation that has occurred to the New York Times. Can you tell us what that was?
Well, that electric cars need electricity. It's just news to them. This was their lead story a few days ago, and it began very dramatically about how something strange is happening in the United States. After usage had been flat for many years, suddenly we're using more electricity, and it's a big surprise. And I I did honestly find it funny, and the bigger picture is of course not funny, in that we have politicians passing legally binding requirements of selling electric cars, and wanting us to go all electric on everything. It's not just the cars, but they want to get rid of gas cookers in the United States. They want to, and both the UK and the US want us to go to heat pumps, and heat pumps use a lot of electricity. And yet no one seems to have asked the question as to whether or not we have the capacity to generate that electricity. And that's so primitive that you really feel you are in the grip of people who are, not to put too fine a point on it, utter morons. I mean, that's the first thing you should do. And furthermore, you don't push people to get electric cars and electric everything and put in all these heat pumps before you get the grid capacity. It's the ultimate cart before horse situation.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is rank incompetence, and at scale, at national scale. And I'm afraid it's both the United States and the UK. And though I don't know the figures elsewhere, I wouldn't be surprised if this is Western wide, that this is an ideological project. It's a religious project, and therefore nobody wants to bother themselves with the untidy little practicalities. And it's not just the grid, but there are sub problems. For example, if you want to use green energy, particularly, if you have to connect those solar and wind farms to the grid, and it's not just a matter of running an extension cord, right? You have to build these huge high capacity power lines. Most of them are above ground. It's an enormous undertaking. It requires a lot of material, including these enormous transformers, which the US does not have the capacity to produce at scale. And it also requires a lot of legal permissions. And in the United States, especially, it means often crossing state lines, and that's a bureaucratic nightmare. The ultimate joke on the whole project is that certainly in the US, they're busy building gas-fired power plants all over to cover the cost of powering green energy. I mean, all this electricity stuff that we're supposed to use instead of evil fossil fuels is going to be powered by fossil fuels. It makes the entire project a joke. And there's even a utility in Kansas that is keeping a coal-fired power plant online that they had been going to retire specifically in order to power a giant EV battery factory.
It's kind of remarkable that sort of the resurrection of fossil fuels because of the green agenda. I mean, something that we've had in the UK as well is the intermittency problem that you mentioned. In the basic way, what do you do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? I mean, have you got any sense that the US has sort of prepared for that in any way, or have they just kind of stumbled blindly into where they are now?
Not in the least. I'm sure we're all really tired. That same expression, I get so tired of it. When the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. We've all read it over and over and over again. So you would think that they would have sorted it because some of these people are reading the same articles we are, but no. And there is no alternative right now to building what is ultimately a redundant system, so that you actually have two energy systems. Does that sound cheap to you? Right? So you have to have a backup. And furthermore, firing up gas-fired power stations only when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine is expensive, because it's like anything. It's easier to keep it running all the time. So, I mean, I just think that we're in the midst of a fiasco, and at fantastic scale. And all of these net zero laws have been rushed in. The aims or the deadlines are unfeasible, and I just think we have to have a complete rethink. Now, I can see that we're going to have to, in the U.S. especially, we're going to have to increase electrical capacity, partly because Biden is successfully bringing in more manufacturing in the United States, but that takes power.
Lionel, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned there the sort of the driver of this, because in the UK we've obviously had a lot of drama about net zero, but it's maybe passed a lot of people by that Biden has kind of made a similar pledge to have clean energy by 2035. Do you think that's the main driver of what's going on here and why it's causing problems?
Well, as I said, this is a political project, and it has been engineered by people who are not engineers. Okay, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know they don't know the technical specs of what they want, and the whole thing has been brought in with the bizarre and blasé assumption that if we don't have the technology now, we'll have it later, and that's more cart before horse. I mean, that's just not the way innovation works. You don't require innovation that you don't have yet. You can inspire it. Great if it would be good if you could solve that problem, but you do not make public policy around technology that does not exist. And battery technology, for example, is completely, it's untenable in its current form. It requires way too many rare earths, way too much copper. It's not doable, and it's not scalable, and it's way too expensive. It doesn't work. And so to say, oh, well, battery technology is improving and it will be really great in 5 years. Well, that's like praying.
I think
It's not like science.
I think you mentioned in the piece as well, Lionel, that the Biden administration hasn't been particularly helpful either towards nuclear power, which could maybe solve some of those intermittency problems. Do you mind telling us a bit about that?
Well, the United States also, as the UK does, has a problem with a popular hostility to nuclear. But if you're going to go for a clean energy future, that's clearly the only practical thing to do, and that is a technology that we do have, and it doesn't use fossil fuels, and it doesn't have carbon emissions. So, but the problem is that the regulation behind nuclear power plants is fantastically burdensome, and it's getting through the regulatory process that makes building a nuclear power plant in the United States it takes like 20 to 25 years. So you really have to think ahead. And I do find it comical that it's really the same political people, almost always the Democrats, who have passed all this regulation, and now they're getting in their own way, right? They're tripping over their own regulations, and they can't achieve their own goals of Biden wants to have completely carbon-free electricity by 2035, which is like tomorrow. So that would be wind, solar, and nuclear. But we don't have time. We don't have time. You're not going to have any nuclear power plants, even if you start right now by 2035. So, it's a kind of variation of being hoisted on your own petard. It's hoisted on your own terrible, complicated, time-consuming regulations.
Seems very pie in the sky at the moment. You mentioned as well that there's other Biden regulations or legislation that's making things worse in terms of electricity in the grid, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. Can you sort of tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course does nothing but increase inflation because it's about spending trillions of dollars that the United States doesn't actually have. It includes a lot of green energy pork, all right, and therefore there's a certain amount of money for building chargers for EVs. Although I think I read today that it's only enough for something like 4,000. And if you know anything about the extent of the U.S., that's just ridiculous.
Is that charging point? Sorry, Lionel.
The charging things, that you plug it in on the street, but that's not nearly good enough for covering the whole country. And there are these targets to have half of the cars on the road EVs by 2035, and that right now it's 8%. That's not achievable, and that's fortunate it's not achievable, because if everyone plugged in their 50% of the cars in the United States, the entire country would explode. I mean, I was reading in the Wall Street Journal today that on average, when you plug in an EV in an American household, you double the amount of usage immediately. And if you were to have 2 electric cars and plug them in, you triple your usage immediately. And is this piece observed? If all of your neighbors do the same thing, the transformer at the end of the street explodes. So I'm not, I say the place would explode. I'm not being metaphorical.
Right. Thank you very much, Lionel. It's good to know there's a country with just as bad an energy policy as the UK.
Oh yes, we're both in the same leaky boat.